Welcome to QueerJoe. Today's blog on characteristics of linen stitch can be viewed or read. Both are approximately the same, but since video allows me to demonstrate more about a stitch fabric, drape, and the stitch pattern itself, the video is a little bit better. Linen stitch, character traits. Lou commented on the blog post from this past Friday. He wrote, "I'm hoping you'll post a photo of the finished linen stitch scarf. I have found the stitch to be rigid and a real yarn eater, but not drapey and with little or no give. Maybe if it were in a really smushy yarn, it would be more pleasing." First of all, thank you, Lou, for your comments and encouragement. I could easily have answered your question in a lot fewer words, but I thought the linen stitch deserved a bit more in-depth discussion. First of all, what is linen stitch? The stitch pattern is as follows. Cast on an even number of stitches, and on the right side, knit one, slip one with yarn in front, and on the back, knit one, slip one with yarn in front. Bring it back, knit one, slip one with yarn in front, knit one, slip one with yarn in front, slip one, knit one, slip one. And then on the reverse side, it's a very similar stitch. You start with on the one that you just finished by slipping, you purl it, and then with the yarn in back, you slip it. So it's purl one, yarn to the back, slip one, purl one, yarn to the back, and slip one, purl one, yarn to. Some of the good characteristics of this particular stitch are it creates a very woven-like fabric. It also blends variegated yarns and multicolored yarns very well, and it minimizes bad pooling and striping of yarns. It also has a nice effect when you're putting in stripes of different colors yarn in your work. You'll find that gradually blends the stripes by slip stitches that kind of blend the colors in a way that's very pleasing. Some of the bad characteristics: knitting grows very slowly. You have to realize, since you're slipping every other stitch in every row, each 2 rows makes up the equivalent of 1 row of stockinette. So the length of your knitting grows a lot more slowly. It creates a very dense fabric. As Lou indicated, it's kind of a rigid, dense fabric. The selvage edge, I also think, looks a little bit messy. It's not as neat as some of the other selvage edges you can do. I also found that based on how you cast on and bind off your work, the fabric can waffle or ruffle a little bit at the edges. And finally, the reverse of the fabric isn't quite as appealing as the front of the fabric. The front of the fabric looks very flat and woven-like, whereas the back looks kind of like the back of pearl, of a stockinette stitch. It's kind of like the pearl bumps on the back. Some of the hints and tips that I would offer in terms of doing stockinette linen stitch is always go up at least 2 needle sizes when you're doing it. This gets rid of that rigidness and tightness of the stitch. In fact, the scarf that I've been knitting, and I'll show you at the end of this, is knit on US 8 needles and fingering weight yarn. So typically what I normally knit on US 3 needles, I'm knitting on US 8 or 5mm needles. So it's a significant bump up in the diameter of the needle to prevent it from being exactly that kind of rigid, tightly knit stitch. I also use a different selvage edge on all of my linen stitch knitting. In this particular scarf, I ended up using a kind of a slip rib stitch. I basically knit one and slip one purlwise with the yarn in front, and then do that 3 times basically. So I have a knit one sort of slip purled rib sort of look to it. That way I maintain the same row gauge and yet get a kind of a tighter edge, and I'll show you a close-up of that when we go to it. Finally, the cast on and the bind off, it's one of the few times I recommend that you do it a little tighter than you normally would. If you think about it, most of the times your cast on and your cast off are full width stitches, whereas your linen stitch is kind of only 1.5 stitches since you're slipping every other stitch. And so you want your cast on and your bind off to be somewhat more tight than usual. Finally, current knitting. I have been, as you can well imagine, I have been working feverishly on doing that very linen stitch scarf that we were talking about that Lou commented on. This is the final scarf, and you'll see some better photos of it. But some of the things that I do want to show you is the, I'll show you on the edge. I do have a couple. So on the edge, basically what I did was, you'll notice, and that's the reverse of the stitch, I did kind of what looks like a ribbing or a stockinette stitch, but it's basically, you're only seeing the slipped or the knit stitches, and there's a slipped purl on the other side of it that makes it that elongated, sort of like ribbing look. And it gives it kind of a nice, neat edge, and it still matches the row gauge of the linen stitch. So I was able to finish that. I do have a few ends to weave in, but other than that, it's done, and you can look at some of the photos on the web. And thanks for stopping by. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment, and certainly subscribe to the blog if you can.